No distress signal, no wreckage, no oil slick, no lifeboats. 306 men, 19,000 tons of steel. Gone. The USS Cyclops departed Salvador, Brazil, on March 4, 1918, carrying 10,000 tons of manganese ore toward Baltimore. The ship never arrived. The United States Navy classified the case as lost without trace. Official records explain storms, mechanical failures, enemy action. But what explains a warship vanishing without sending a single word for help? The last wireless message from the Cyclops left the radio room at 1400 hours on March 4th. Radio operator Daniel Pierce transmitted routine position and status to the nearest naval station. The message contained no indication of distress, no mention of weather concerns, no request for assistance. The transmission ended with standard protocol. Pierce signed off. The Cyclops continued north, through waters the Navy had cleared for commercial and military traffic. The ship carried enough coal for the voyage. The engines had been inspected in Rio de Janeiro 2 weeks earlier. The crew manifest listed 306 souls aboard. Captain George Worley commanded from the bridge. Lieutenant James Morrison served as executive officer. Chief Engineer Robert Sullivan oversaw the engine room. The ship's registry showed her as a Proteus-class collier, built in 1910 for hauling coal and ore across the Atlantic. She displaced 19,360 tons fully loaded. Her twin steam engines could push her at 15 knots in calm seas. The Cyclops had left Barbados on March 3rd, taking on fresh water and minor supplies. Harbour records showed the departure as unremarkable. No crew member deserted. No officer filed unusual reports. The vessel cleared the breakwater at dawn and turned northwest toward the Chesapeake Bay. The planned route would take her through open ocean, passing east of the Bahamas, then north along the American coast. Standard naval procedure required position reports every 12 hours during wartime crossings. The Cyclops sent her final transmission 24 hours into the voyage. After that, silence. By March 13th, Naval Command in Baltimore began sending inquiries to ports along the eastern seaboard. No station had received communication from the Cyclops. No lookout had sighted her. No merchant vessel reported passing her at sea. The Navy dispatched search planes from Hampton Roads. Patrol boats swept the predicted route from Barbados to Virginia. Coast Guard stations from Florida to Maryland received alerts to watch for wreckage or survivors. Nothing appeared. The ocean held no trace of the ship. The official investigation opened on March 20th. Naval intelligence interviewed dock workers in Salvador and Barbados. Both ports confirmed the Cyclops had departed without incident. The cargo manifest listed 10,800 tons of manganese ore stacked in the forward and aft holds. Manganese was critical for steel production. The war effort demanded constant shipments from Brazil to American foundries. The Cyclops had made the run before. Her holds were designed to carry heavy bulk cargo. The weight distribution followed standard loading procedures. Harbour inspectors in Salvador had signed the clearance papers without notes or warnings. Lieutenant Morrison's service record showed 10 years in the Navy. He had crossed the Atlantic 16 times on colliers. Chief Engineer Sullivan had served on steam vessels since 1903. His maintenance logs from Rio showed routine work, boiler cleaning, bearing lubrication, pump inspections. Nothing indicated structural problems. Radio operator Pierce had been with the ship for 11 months. His transmission logs were complete through March 4th. The wireless set functioned normally. Pierce had sent and received messages daily during the voyage from Rio to Salvador. The equipment showed no signs of failure. The crew included men from across the United States. Seaman Frank Kowalski had enlisted in Philadelphia. Boatswain Thomas McCarthy came from Boston. Fireman William Schmidt had immigrated from Germany in 1912. The ship carried standard emergency equipment. Lifeboats hung in davits on both sides of the main deck. Life vests were stored in lockers near the crew quarters. Flares and signal lamps were inventoried in the bridge locker. Emergency protocols required the crew to muster at assigned stations if the captain ordered abandoned ship. The protocol assumed time to launch boats, time to signal distress, time to prepare. Naval Command reviewed weather reports for the first 2 weeks of March. A storm system had moved through the Caribbean between March 7th and March 9th. Wind speeds reached 40 knots. Seas built to 12 feet. The storm tracked northwest, crossing the Cyclops' projected path. Colliers had survived worse weather. The Proteus-class design included reinforced hulls and watertight compartments. The ships were built to handle heavy seas. But the storm arrived 5 days after the Cyclops went silent. The timeline didn't align. If weather had been the cause, the ship would have sent distress calls on March 7th or 8th, not stopped transmitting on March 4th. German U-boats operated in the Atlantic throughout 1918. Submarine activity had been reported off the American coast and in the Caribbean. Naval intelligence reviewed U-boat patrol logs captured later in the war. No German submarine claimed an attack on the Cyclops. No commander reported sighting an American collier between March 4th and March 13th. Torpedo strikes left wreckage, oil slicks, floating debris, bodies. Search planes found none of these. If a submarine had attacked, some evidence would have surfaced. The ocean doesn't hide everything. Captain Worley's command history included a reprimand in 1916 for failing to follow coaling schedules. He had also been noted for maintaining strict discipline aboard ship. Crew complaints from previous voyages mentioned harsh punishments for minor infractions, but no formal charges had ever been filed. Worley remained in command. The Navy trusted him with wartime cargo runs. His personnel file showed no indication of instability or incompetence. He had commanded the Cyclops since 1917. The ship had completed multiple transatlantic crossings under his watch. By April, the search officially ended. The Navy issued a statement classifying the Cyclops as lost at sea with all hands. No cause was determined. No wreckage was recovered. No bodies were found. The case file remained open, but inactive. Families of the crew received death certificates listing the date of loss as March 4th, 1918, the exact date of the last transmission. The paperwork acknowledged uncertainty. The certificates noted presumed lost at sea. The word presumed carried weight. It meant the Navy didn't know. It meant the ocean had kept a secret. The cargo itself became a subject of scrutiny. 10,800 tons of manganese ore represented one of the largest shipments ever loaded onto a Proteus-class collier. Naval architects later calculated the weight distribution. The ore filled both forward and aft holds, leaving the center section lighter. This created what engineers call longitudinal stress. The ship's keel had to support extreme weight at both ends, while the middle section rode higher in the water. The design assumed balanced loading. The Cyclops had been built to carry coal, which distributed more evenly. Manganese ore was denser. It concentrated weight in smaller spaces. Chief Engineer Sullivan's maintenance reports from Rio mentioned no structural concerns. But those reports focused on machinery, boilers, pumps, propeller shafts. The hull itself received only visual inspection. No one performed stress calculations on the loaded ship. Harbor inspectors in Salvador checked the waterline and confirmed the vessel sat within safe draft limits. The Cyclops departed with proper freeboard. She wasn't riding dangerously low. The numbers said she was seaworthy, but the numbers didn't account for dynamic forces. A ship at sea doesn't sit still. Waves push the bow up while the stern drops. Then the cycle reverses. Each wave creates bending stress along the keel. A ship with concentrated weight at both ends experiences amplified stress at the midpoint. Naval engineers call this hogging and sagging. If the stress exceeds the hull's strength, the keel cracks. The crack propagates rapidly through riveted plates. Within minutes, the ship breaks in half. Both sections flood and sink. There's no time to send distress signals, no time to launch lifeboats. The crew goes down with the ship. This failure mode had occurred before. The British freighter SS Waratah vanished off South Africa in 1909. No wreckage was ever found. The Japanese cargo ship Ryosei Maru disappeared in 1913, also without trace. Both ships had been carrying dense cargo. Both had broken radio silence and then gone silent. Naval architects suspected structural failure in both cases, but without wreckage, no conclusion could be confirmed. The ocean floor keeps its evidence. The Waratah case had particularly troubling similarities. The ship carried coal and lead ore in her holds. Passengers on her previous voyage reported unsettling behavior in heavy seas. The vessel developed a pronounced list that took hours to correct. One passenger described the ship as feeling top-heavy and unstable. The Waratah's captain dismissed these concerns publicly. The ship departed Durban on July 26, 1909, with 211 souls aboard. She was never seen again. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies. The Australian government conducted an extensive inquiry. The final report suggested structural failure as the most probable cause, but could offer no proof. The pattern repeated with disturbing consistency across the early 20th century. Ships carrying dense cargo loads vanished with complete silence. The SS Cyclops would become the most famous case, but she was not the first. She was simply the largest. The loss of 306 lives made the disappearance impossible to ignore, even as the Navy tried to file it quietly away. The Cyclops had one additional vulnerability. Her engines were mismatched. The starboard engine produced more power than the port engine. This imbalance had been noted in previous voyages. Crew members reported the ship pulled to port when both engines ran at full power. Captain Worley compensated by running the starboard engine at reduced throttle during open ocean crossings. This kept the ship on course, but created uneven vibration through the hull. Over time, vibration fatigues metal. Rivets loosen. Plates develop hairline cracks. The cracks grow with each voyage. Lieutenant Morrison had filed a report in January noting excessive vibration in the crew quarters. The report recommended dry dock inspection at the next opportunity. That opportunity never came. The war created urgent demand for manganese. The Navy kept the Cyclops in service. Dry dock time meant lost cargo runs, lost revenue, delayed steel production. The ship kept sailing. Radio operator Pierce's final transmission contained one detail that later drew attention. The message noted sea conditions as moderate. Moderate seas meant swells of 4 to 6 feet, routine for a vessel the size of the Cyclops. But the message also included a barometric pressure reading, 29.8 inches of mercury. That pressure suggested stable weather, no storm formation, no reason for concern. Yet 24 hours later, the Cyclops ceased all communication. Naval Intelligence interviewed the wireless operator at the Barbados station, who had received Pierce's last message. The operator remembered the transmission as routine. Pierce's signature style included short, efficient phrasing. The final message matched that pattern. No hesitation. No unusual spacing between words. No coded warnings. If Pierce had suspected trouble, he gave no indication. The transmission ended cleanly. The operator waited for the next scheduled check-in 12 hours later. It never came. The search planes from Hampton Roads covered thousands of square miles. Pilots flew grid patterns over the projected route. They looked for debris, oil slicks, life vests, wooden hatch covers, anything that floats. The ocean was clear. Some merchant captains later reported seeing what they thought might be wreckage, but investigation revealed the objects were unrelated. Driftwood, fishing gear, natural debris. None of it matched materials from the Cyclops. One witness account stood apart from the others. A lighthouse keeper on Great Inagua Island reported seeing a large vessel pass to the north on the night of March 5th. The ship showed no lights, This violated wartime protocol. All vessels were required to show running lights in coastal waters to avoid collisions. The keeper noted the sighting in his log, but didn't report it immediately. He assumed the ship was trying to avoid U-boat detection. Dark running was common practice in submarine zones. By the time the keeper connected the sighting to the Cyclops investigation, weeks had passed. His testimony couldn't be verified. No other witness corroborated the dark ship. The Navy's final investigative report, released in October 1918, listed 5 possible scenarios. Structural failure due to overloading, capsizing in sudden storm, U-boat attack despite lack of German records, mutiny and scuttling, defection by Captain Worley to a German port. The report assigned no probability to any scenario. It simply acknowledged that without physical evidence, no conclusion could be reached. The case remained open. The file went into storage. 27 years later, during World War II, the Navy reviewed the Cyclops file as part of a broader study on merchant marine losses. The review found no new evidence, but it did uncover one additional detail. 2 sister ships of the Cyclops, the USS Proteus and USS Nereus, also vanished without trace during the early 1940s. Both ships disappeared in the same general region. Both were carrying heavy ore cargo. Both went silent without distress calls. The 3 Proteus-class colliers represented the only major vessels of their type. All 3 were gone. The ocean had claimed the entire class. Interviews with surviving crew members from earlier Cyclops voyages revealed a pattern. Seaman Patrick O'Brien had served aboard the ship in 1917 before transferring to another vessel. He described hearing metallic groaning sounds below decks during heavy weather. The sounds came from the forward hold area. O'Brien reported the noise to boatswain McCarthy, who dismissed it as normal expansion and contraction of the hull. "Ships make noise," McCarthy had said. "Steel flexes. Nothing to worry about." But another former crew member, fireman Joseph Brennan, described something more specific. During a voyage in December 1917, Brennan had been working in the engine room when he felt the deck shift beneath his feet. The movement lasted only seconds. It felt like the ship had twisted slightly along its length and then snapped back. Chief Engineer Sullivan ordered an immediate inspection of the keel area. Brennan accompanied him into the lower spaces between the holds. They found nothing visible, no cracks in the plates, no loose rivets. Sullivan logged the incident as minor structural movement within normal parameters. The phrase "normal parameters" appeared frequently in Sullivan's maintenance logs. It appeared after reports of vibration, after complaints about grinding noises from the propeller shafts, after observations of rust staining along rivet lines. Each time, Sullivan's conclusion was the same: nothing outside normal wear for a ship of this age and service record. The Cyclops was 8 years old in 1918. Not new, but not ancient. Coal haulers typically lasted 20 years or more with proper maintenance. 8 years should have been mid-life. But the Cyclops hadn't been hauling coal exclusively. Naval records showed she had carried manganese ore on 4 previous occasions. Each time, the cargo manifest listed weights between 8,000 and 9,000 tons. The final voyage carried 10,800 tons. The heaviest load the ship had ever attempted. Someone in the supply chain had decided the vessel could handle the extra weight. The decision was never documented in writing. No authorization form. No engineering review. Just numbers on a loading manifest in Salvador. Captain Worley's behavior during the voyage from Rio to Salvador drew scrutiny after the disappearance. Several witnesses in Rio reported seeing Worley drinking heavily in a waterfront tavern on the night before departure. One witness, a merchant marine officer named Edward Collins, stated that Worley had appeared agitated and defensive when Collins asked about the Cyclops' mechanical condition. Worley insisted the ship was sound. He said the Navy was pushing him to make faster runs. He said the war didn't allow time for unnecessary repairs. Collins's statement appeared in the investigative file as a footnote. The Navy didn't pursue it further. Worley's alcohol consumption was noted as not unusual for officers on shore leave. The phrase suggested the behavior was common. The investigation moved on to other theories. Lieutenant Morrison's sister provided a letter he had written to her in February 1918. The letter mentioned tension between Morrison and Captain Worley. Morrison wrote that Worley had become increasingly erratic in his decision-making and that several officers had privately expressed concerns. The letter specifically mentioned the ship's tendency to list to starboard when heavily loaded. Morrison described how the crew had to shift ballast manually to correct the list during a January voyage. The process took hours. It required moving heavy equipment and stored materials from one side of the ship to the other. Morrison noted that this should not have been necessary on a properly designed vessel. The letter ended with a sentence that Morrison's sister later highlighted for investigators. "I will request transfer after we deliver this cargo to Baltimore. The ship is not safe with this captain and this load." Morrison never had the opportunity to file that transfer request. He went down with the Cyclops. The Navy interviewed Chief Engineer Sullivan's wife after the disappearance. She provided his personal journal, which he had left at home during the final voyage. The journal contained technical sketches and calculations. Sullivan had been privately studying the stress dynamics of heavy ore loads on Proteus-class hulls. His calculations suggested that loads exceeding 9,500 tons created dangerous stress concentrations at the midship section. He had circled one calculation and written in the margin, "Critical threshold, request load limit." There was no evidence he ever formally submitted that request. Radio operator Pierce's roommate in Baltimore provided Pierce's last letter home, written from Barbados. The letter was brief. Pierce mentioned that the ship was carrying the heaviest load yet and that Captain Worley had ordered maximum speed for the return voyage. Pierce noted that maintaining maximum speed with mismatched engines would create rough conditions below decks. The letter contained no alarm, just observations. Pierce signed off by saying he would be home within 10 days. The letter was postmarked March 3rd, the day before the final transmission. Deep-sea fishing crews working the waters east of the Bahamas in 1918 and 1919 occasionally reported unusual debris washing ashore on uninhabited cays. One crew found a life preserver ring with faded lettering. The visible letters were CYOPS. Navy investigators examined photographs of the ring, but couldn't confirm it came from the USS Cyclops. Life preservers from the era used standard military issue. Many ships had similar equipment. The ring could have come from any vessel. Without serial numbers or unique markings, the evidence meant nothing official. A more compelling find occurred in 1920. A commercial diver working on pier repairs in Nassau recovered a ship's bell from the harbour floor. The bell bore markings consistent with US Navy issue from 1910 to 1915. Corrosion had obscured most details, but maritime archaeologists later identified partial lettering that might have read USS before trailing off into corroded metal. The Navy examined the bell but never added it to the official Cyclops file. The uncertainty was too great. Dozens of Navy vessels with names beginning with C had operated in Caribbean waters during that period. These fragments of possible evidence never accumulated into proof. They sat in archive boxes. Photographs in folders, mentions in footnote sections of investigation supplements. The Navy required definitive identification for any finding to officially close a case. Definitive identification required hull plates with registry numbers, engine components with manufacturer stamps, personal effects with engraved names. None of these ever surfaced. The fragments remained fragments. The sequence of events can be established with reasonable certainty. The USS Cyclops departed Salvador on March 4th, carrying the heaviest cargo load in her operational history. The ship transmitted a final routine message 24 hours into the voyage reporting normal conditions. Within the next 12 hours, the vessel ceased all communication and vanished. No distress signal was sent. no wreckage was ever officially recovered. 306 crew members were lost. The most consistent explanation points to catastrophic structural failure. The evidence supports this conclusion through multiple data points. Chief Engineer Sullivan's private calculations identified 9,500 tons as a critical threshold for Proteus-class hulls. The Cyclops carried 10,800 tons. Former crew members reported metallic groaning sounds and deck movement during previous voyages with lighter loads. Lieutenant Morrison documented excessive vibration and recommended dry dock inspection. The ship's mismatched engines created constant asymmetric stress on an already compromised hull. The concentrated weight of manganese ore at bow and stern created extreme longitudinal stress during normal wave action. When a ship's keel fails under these conditions, the sequence happens rapidly. The initial crack propagates through riveted plates within seconds. The hull separates at the weakest point, typically amidships where stress concentrations are highest. Both sections flood immediately through the massive opening. A 19,000-ton collier can sink in under 3 minutes once the keel parts. The crew has no time to reach the radio room, no time to launch lifeboats, no time to send emergency signals. The depth of the Atlantic in that region exceeds 15,000 feet. Both sections of the hull would have reached the seafloor within hours, settling into sediment that has since buried them under decades of accumulation. This explanation accounts for the lack of surface debris. When a ship breaks and sinks quickly, most material goes down with it. Wooden deck fittings and cork life vests can be pulled under by suction from the sinking hull sections. The scattered debris that does float often disperses over hundreds of square miles within days. Search aircraft in 1918 covered vast areas, but without modern detection equipment, small scattered debris fields were nearly impossible to locate in open ocean. The Navy never officially assigned blame for the loss. No court-martial was convened. No board of inquiry issued findings of negligence. The case was classified as lost without determined cause and filed as a wartime casualty. Captain Worley's reputation remained intact in official records. Chief Engineer Sullivan's maintenance logs were accepted as complete and professional. The supply officers who authorized the cargo load were not questioned. The harbor inspectors in Salvador who signed the clearance papers faced no review. The institutional response prioritized continuity over accountability. The lack of formal investigation reflected the Navy's institutional reluctance to acknowledge systemic failures during wartime operations. The loss did have consequences, though they arrived quietly. After 1918, the Navy implemented new loading procedures for ore carriers. Maximum cargo weights were formally calculated and documented for each vessel class. Engineers were required to review stress calculations before approving heavy loads. Dry dock inspection intervals were shortened for ships carrying dense cargo. These changes appeared in internal memos and revised operational manuals. They were never publicly connected to the Cyclops loss. The Navy didn't announce that 306 men had died because proper engineering oversight had been absent. The connection existed only in the technical documentation. The families of the crew received standard death benefits. Widows were granted pensions. Children received educational stipends. The payments continued for decades. But the official cause of death remained presumed lost at sea. No details. No explanation. No closure. The Navy's institutional memory absorbed the loss and moved forward. War continued. Ships were needed. Cargo had to move. The operational tempo didn't allow time for extended grieving or public inquiry. The wives of the lost men formed a support group in Baltimore. They met monthly for years after the disappearance. Some held hope that their husbands had somehow survived, perhaps stranded on an island or picked up by a neutral vessel. Others accepted the loss, but demanded answers. Mrs. Catherine Sullivan, the chief engineer's widow, spent 5 years petitioning the Navy for access to her husband's maintenance logs. The Navy finally released heavily redacted copies in 1923. The sections detailing structural concerns had been removed. Mrs. Sullivan died in 1931, still seeking the full truth about why her husband's warnings had been ignored. The children of the crew grew up with questions their mothers couldn't answer. Some became engineers and naval architects themselves, driven by a need to understand what had taken their fathers. Thomas McCarthy Jr., son of the lost boatswain, joined the Navy in 1935. He specialized in ship structural analysis. His career focused on preventing the kind of failure that had claimed his father. He never spoke publicly about the Cyclops, but his technical papers on load distribution and keel stress became required reading in naval engineering programs. Local communities erected memorials. Philadelphia honored Seaman Kowalski. Boston remembered Boatswain McCarthy. Baltimore built a small monument listing all 306 names. The dedications mentioned service and sacrifice. They spoke of the dangers of the sea. None mentioned overloading. None mentioned skipped maintenance. None mentioned the mismatched engines or the warnings that were documented but never acted upon. If the evidence existed in maintenance logs and officer reports, why did no one force the ship into dry dock for proper inspection?